My part of the presentation is to talk about long-term interim moderators. This is a kind of a new situation for us in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, because typically the role of the interim moderator has been to help a church get a new minister, and as such, it's typically a temporary role. There has always been exceptions to that, but right now the exception has become the norm. As I do this workshop, about 30% of the Presbyterian churches in Canada are vacant, and of that 30%, about 15% are looking for calls or some kind of appointment. That is not to say that they don't all have ministers, but it does say that there are more and more ministries and congregations where being an interim moderator is a long-term, if not a permanent appointment. As we look here at the Book of Forms, we see section 213, when a congregation becomes vacant, the Presbytery of the Bounds appoints one of its ministers interim moderator of the said session of the said congregation. The Presbytery usually empowers an interim moderator to proceed to moderation and a call to a minister to fill the vacancy as soon as he or she has satisfactory evidence that the congregation is ready to make a choice. You can actually see that even the Book of Forms hasn't quite caught up with this new reality, and we pray that it will soon. But it's also important to remember 213.1, that the interim moderator must conserve the interests of both the presbytery and the congregation, that great care should be taken in appointing such as shall be acceptable to both. Certainly, the notion that the interim moderator should be acceptable and agreeable to the congregation is terrific. And in fact, often congregations have a voice in who their interim moderator will be. But I think it's important that we remember, particularly at this time, that we are not actually agents of the congregation, that we are agents of the presbytery in this time, in this moment. And I think that's an important realization, because what we are doing is we are making the best decision, really, at some level, for the presbytery, which may or may not always be at least the perceived best decision for the congregation. As you move forward into this, and if you're watching this, you will almost certainly find yourself in this position. I know that I am. As an interim moderator, you have a task, and if that task is not to move the congregation from a vacant pulpit to a filled pulpit, then it has to be something else. You're still called to take the congregation somewhere. It may be that you're taking the congregation from being open to being closed. It may be that it's being moved from being separate, as in a one-point charge, to a multiple point, or an amalgamation, or an ecumenical shared ministry. It could be that part of the task is just to move from sick to healing, to healed, so that a congregation that is perhaps depleted because of conflict might find itself back and able to minister again. But we have to take them somewhere. And it may not be a short term somewhere, as it would be in a regular interim moderatorship, which would be typically under a year. It may be longer, but it still has to take them somewhere. As you get started in this process, it really is exactly the same as it would be for any other interim moderatorship. As soon as you can, meet with the clerk of session, meet with the session without the previous minister. And one of the first things that in every situation that you have to do is you have to establish where the previous minister is going and clearly establish boundaries around that. It may be that the minister, in fact, I would almost say it often is the case that if the minister is retiring, that individual may be retiring in the community. One scenario that we even find more and more is that the minister will retire from full-time called ministry, but then would seek to immediately pick up with the same congregation, perhaps in a part-time appointed capacity. Understand that even that still needs an interim moderator. Even that still needs the blessing of the presbytery. And I wouldn't take it as a given. I think it's often easy when everybody's in the room for people to say, oh, well, we really like our old minister and we want that individual to stay. But it may be that when you're meeting without the minister that you get a very different story. And again, part of that is also not what's best for the minister, but what's best for the congregation. work with the presbytery to ensure that exit interviews happen in a timely manner, and declare the pulpit vacant. These are all the normal, regular steps. Now, it may be that you are replacing another interim moderator, so it may have been that many of these steps have already taken place. However, if they've not, please be mindful of them. Similarly, part of your task is an initial assessment of the congregation. And again, when I say initial, it may in fact turn out to be an ongoing assessment of the situation. It shouldn't take much more than a month if you're beginning in this, if you're there right after the ministry's left. And I think the first question is the congregation viable? And there's a number of ways to measure viability. The simple reality of our tradition, of our denomination, of our circumstance right now is that usually means financial viability. Can they afford another minister? And it may be that they assure you that they can, but to do so would require a heavy leaning upon either rental income or more often capital. And it's amazing how quickly a congregation can burn through its capital when they have a full-time minister that they really can't afford. Is there conflict? Are there unresolved tensions? Are there issues that need to be dealt with? Again, these are many of the typical things of an interim moderator. But at this point in the life of a congregation, often when there has been a decline, when the congregation is on the cusp of viability, it's often there is an increase in conflict. There's an increase in blaming. There's an increase in just general grumpiness. And that usually needs to be at least identified, if not addressed. Can their previous minister say goodbye, or will that individual need help saying goodbye? I was joking about the old country and western song, how can I miss you if you won't go away? But I think that part of the transition to any new ministry, any new model of ministry involves saying goodbye. Now, again, we live in a very different world. It may be that after a time, the individual continues to be a part of that congregation. It may even be that, as mentioned, the individual continues to work part-time for the congregation. But all of that needs to be clear, and it really needs to be above board. Is an interim minister required? Is respite care required? Just what do they need right now? How does the session function? How badly does the role need to be revised? Now, this is less of an issue where another minister is not forthcoming, but I think it's still worth looking at, if for no other reason, that it helps congregations, it helps sessions understand the reality of their situation. If a congregation says, oh, we have 150, 200 members, of course we can get a minister, and then you revise the role and you see, oh, there's really only 60 members. That can be a very important and a very needed reality check. And then what else needs doing? Does the manse need attending to? Will the manse be rented? Will it be sold? Just what is going to happen around that? Does the building need work? Is the building safe? What's going on with committees? Are they right-sized? Often we find congregations at this point in their life probably have too many committees and too many elders, not too few. And also what's required around pastoral care. Are there structures in place? Is there a prayer chain? Are there visitors? All of those things need to become a part of the list that you provide, or the list that you go through as you understand what your role will be. If the ministry is not viable, and you need to be clear with them about this. One of the things that I have always appreciated about being an interim moderator is that in a very kind of weird way, I get to be more of a hard-nosed individual with them than I would with my own congregation. Partly because I don't know them as well, partly because they're really not writing my stipend check. I mean, there's all kinds of pragmatic reasons for that. But I think that a big part of the interim moderator's task in all of this is truth telling, is helping them understand and respond to their situation the way that it is and not the way that they want to be. So if it isn't viable, then the question is, well, what next? What do we do next? And And all of the options for that are greater than the scope of this workshop. At the end of the workshop, you will see my email, you will see Tim Purvis's email. There are many of those around who can help with that kind of conversation, either with you as an interim moderator or indeed with the session itself. But in the meantime, I think the first question that probably needs to be asked around viability is, can it be made viable? And excuse me. And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes there's been a conflict. Sometimes there's a there's a financial drain that if that drain is removed, or there's various scenarios where that could possibly happen. But I think it's important that you beware of magical thinking. What's magical thinking? Magical thinking is the magic that if only we do this, then all our problems will be solved and everything will be fine again. And where this is particularly pertinent in this situation is congregations that, when they do not have to pay the stipend and housing of a minister, are able to accumulate a surplus. And after a time, they look at the surplus and they say, well, we're ready to call a minister. Look at the surplus that we have. And the assumption in that call is that in a relatively short time, usually a year to 18 months, that the minister, by their magical gifts, will be able to grow the church to the point that they won't be bleeding money anymore, that they'll be balancing their budget and everything will be fine. Well, never mind the fact that that's literally impossible. What they are wishing for in a year to 18 months is probably not possible, if it's possible, for 5 to 7 years. So there's a huge mismatch. But what is kind of new in my experience is that with that kind of magical thinking, they'll call a minister, they'll use up their surplus, moving the minister in the first few months of ministry, and then all of a sudden, after a year, 14 months, they're having to lay off the minister because they can't afford them, and because the money has not come in as their magical thinking thought it would. So I think we have to, again, really be clear about what is real, about what is true, and just be very aware of the tendency of the desire to lean towards magical thinking. Another version of this story is the number of ministers who I've heard as interim moderators stand up on the floor of presbytery or stand up in a congregational meeting and say, if we just have enough faith, then this church will grow and this ministry will be sustained. I'm a very big fan of faith, but I think that we need to be clear and we need to be realistic, and we need to be honoring of what faith is, of what trust is. And it's not this kind of Pollyanna, oh, everything's going to work out fine scenario. If the congregation is not viable in a conventional way, or at least the traditional way in terms of a settled minister, then what could it be? Could it be an amalgamation? Amalgamation is between two congregations of the same denomination. Could it be an ecumenical shared ministry? Two congregations of different denominations. This is I think, a particularly good choice when we find ourselves in rural Canada. Is the congregation in palliative care? Is this the last chapter of their life? And that's okay. I think it's important that we understand that churches can and should die well, that fruit is seasonal, and not every congregation is going to come out of this, vibrant and growing. But palliative care is a very different step than amalgamation and ecumenical shared ministry. And I suppose the other would be part-time ministry. And just what does that look like? And again, there are resources. But at the very least, we need to understand, and we need to have the conversation about saying, well, if this isn't going to be a conventional call, if this is not going to be a conventional process, then what? And part of that then what is to understand that even though it's not going to be the same kind of, vacant to filled pulpit scenario, that the clock is still ticking. And that each day that they put off making the decision is another day that it's going to be harder to make the decision, but is also going to be leading to a day where they have fewer and fewer options. The sooner that they can get on this, the sooner that they can respond to this in a healthy and helpful way, the better for all involved, but especially for the congregation. I want to talk for a minute just about what a vacancy does. And what a vacancy does is it upsets the homeostasis of the congregation. It's the homeostasis. Get my words right. And what it does is it knocks the congregation off balance. And what congregations want to do is they want to restore that balance as quickly as possible. We're like that. We like certainty. We don't like uncertainty. I love this picture of Linus and Charlie Brown, but another image that I could have done. I don't know if you've ever seen the cartoons of Linus while this blanket is in the washing machine. That's a little bit what this time is like. And it means that the system is open. And the good thing about a system being open is it's open to the workings of the Holy Spirit. It's open to God's direction. It's open to Christ's call. Not that it's not open when the system is closed, but it actually is harder. It's easier to be attentive when the system is open, when the homeostasis is upset, when we're in the desert, when it's the Exodus. All of those things leave us able to consider options in a way that we haven't that we mightn't have without the need. As a bit of an aside, may I say that in my entire 35 plus years of ministry, that I've never seen congregations more open to change than they are at this very moment. And I think it's because of COVID. I think just that the way that has upset the balance, the way that we've had to flex and be nimble has also led us to a particular kind of openness. But it's a window of opportunity that will close. So the sooner we take advantage of that, better. The reason that I put up this slide, though, is because our job is to keep the system open as long as it takes without closing it ourselves. And what I mean by that is that one of the things that I have observed with long-term interim moderatorships, and I'll be honest, I may even be guilty of it, is that long-term interim moderatorships can actually be very, very beneficial to a congregation. What they get is they get a minister who is there to take care of them, to make sure that the pulpit is full, to make sure that pastoral care takes place, to moderate the session, to see the boards, to do the hospital visits, to do all of those sorts of things, but to do so in an extremely inexpensive way. So all of a sudden they have all of the ministry that they need with almost none of the cost. And you might understand that congregations in that scenario would be in no rush to find a minister. Why would they? If they've got an interim minister or an interim moderator who's there to do all that they need, why would they want to change? Of course, they might not get the same minister every week, but that's okay. They get a sermon. They might not get the same minister visiting, but that's okay. If they're in the hospital, they'll likely get a visit. And so what we can actually do as ministers in this context is we can actually make it worse, not better, because we become the comforting present. We become the ones who close the system down ourselves. And what we do is we present to the congregation a loving, well-meaning, deeply caring alternative that barely costs them anything and gives them very, very little incentive to change. So as I think about this, I think, so what are we to do in this? Because we know that we have to be interim moderators. We know that our polity demands it. We know that that we're supposed to moderate the session, that we're to make sure that the pulpit is full. Well, I think the first thing that we have to do is to not let anybody get too comfortable, including ourselves. The dilemma in a long-term interim moderatorship is that basically what you could easily end up with is 5 years or more of your ministry essentially becoming a two-point charge. And I would argue that may not be the best use of your time. So yes, do what you need to do, but don't make them too comfortable. Don't make it too easy. So it may be that one thing that you say is, sure, you get worship, but you don't get it every week. Or if you want it every week, then elders need to step up and lead worship. You're the ones that need to take responsibility for your worshiping community. I'm not here to do it for you. Another thing that I think it's important to do is to streamline the processes. It seems to me that if a congregation is vacant, and particularly if a congregation is vacant in a time when their viability is really open to question, that they don't have the right to demand your full attention, to demand your full time. So reduce meetings. Tell the session you'll meet with them quarterly, not monthly. Tell the board that you'll be there if they need you, but you're not coming. You're not dropping into all of the meetings. Tell the elders that they need to be doing the hospital visiting or any other kind of volunteer organization or organized group within the congregation. One thing that I have done in a number of congregations, and full disclosure, I'm an interim moderator in a couple of churches right now that are basically permanent. They won't ever be able to call again, but they're in a presbytery that I am an assessor minister in, which is to say that I don't live in the presbytery, and it is quite some distance away. And I mention that because it's not like I could just jump in the car and go moderate a session. Now, in the world of Zoom, you can moderate a session meeting by Zoom, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with explaining to the session that that's the way it's going to be. And they may not like it, but that's the way it's going to be. Remember, keep them a little bit uncomfortable. But one thing that I have done is that I have encouraged the congregation to form a committee of elders, the elders committee. And what that is a committee that is made up of only elders. Now, because it's a committee, it does not require a moderator. It does not require a quorum in that way. But what the elders committee can be empowered to do is to take responsibility for the day-to-day decisions of the church, this rental or that, that use of the church or whatever, without having to have a session meeting. And what we do then is we'll meet, once or twice a year, and we will read the minutes of the elders committee the into the session minutes and homologate them, making them a part of the session record. I would also say in that what the elders committee does not get to do is they do not get to make decisions around the sacraments, around communion, around baptism. Those are the things that belong to the interim moderator. The other thing that I think it would be helpful to do would be to determine a decision date, an end date. And that's not only their decision date, but that may also be your decision date, which is to say, first of all, your decision date, that agreeing to be interim moderator, you may say to the presbytery that you are willing to do this for 2 years, but after that, they need another interim moderator, even if it means that you go on to interim moderate another church. I mean, our presbytery, half the congregations are vacant. You're not going to get away with not being an interim moderator. But again, it keeps people from getting too comfortable. But the other part is the decision date, which is to say to the congregation, we are not going to go on with this indefinitely. We are not going to go on with this till Jesus comes again. We have to make a decision, and we have to make a decision in this amount of time. Pick it a year, 2 years, even 5 years, but we're not waiting 20 to make this decision. One of the issues that I hear over and over again with congregations is they say, well, it's not that we don't like change, just give us a decade to do it. Well, if they've only got 3 or 4 years left, I'm afraid I just can't do that, and you can't do it either. Again, part of the challenge of interim moderatorship in this scenario is not to keep people too comfortable. In fact, keep up the heat. Return to the questions. What are we going to do? What is the decision we are going to make? What is the best for the congregation? And again, part of that is also managing expectations, and that's their expectations and your expectations. And one of the biggest expectations, again, is that magical thinking that somebody somehow is just going to swoop out of nowhere and everything's going to be great again. And that may be, that young minister and young family that he will grow the church because it's always he. That doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. You may have to help manage that expectation. Often I get requested, or asked, why isn't there money from 50 Winter to do this? Well, because they don't have money either. We have to manage the expectations around that. And some of that is just truth telling and saying, no, this is what the real world looks like. And finally, in the midst of all of this, keep calm and carry on. You really are called to be the non-anxious presence in what for many congregations is a very, very anxious time. So be calm, understand that Christ's kingdom endures even if every congregation doesn't. Understand your calling. And your calling is the calling of Moses, is the calling of Joshua, is the calling to say, we are here to get the people of God from point A to point B, and we are here to lead them on the journey. As we think about all of this, feel free to contact me. Feel free to contact Tim Purvis at Ministry Church Vocations. We stand ready to support you. We stand ready to help you in any way, shape, or form. And God, go with God, and God bless, knowing that you are doing a very, very important ministry here. God bless you.